Morning. Thank you for joining us. Today, like other seminars, we have 40 minutes presentation followed by 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A depending on the time. Audience can use the chat box to ask their questions, or they can raise their hand and we'll give them the permission to turn on their audio. Today's presentation will discuss various elements of report writing as a guide to graduate students preparing term project reports, journal articles, theses, and so on. It is our honor to have Professor Miller, Professor of Civil Engineering, Research Director of Data Management and Travel Modeling Group, as well as Director of the University of Toronto Transportation Research Institute for this presentation. Professor Miller, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. We can't wait for your presentation.
Well, great. Thanks, Mustafa, very much for the invitation, and thanks for everybody having me back. This is a presentation I do every once in a while when asked, and actually did it back in early March, so hopefully this isn't getting too redundant. Yeah, so what I want to do this morning is provide some of my views on how we should do technical report writing, some hints, inflict some of my biases perhaps on you in terms of style and so forth, because I think this is an extremely critical aspect of all our lives. You know, you spend most of your time right now in coursework and working on your thesis and perhaps preparing a paper, all very technical aspects of the problem, and technical skills and methods and so forth are, you know, extremely important. But communication, in this case writing, is also an absolute critical part of everything we do, because it doesn't matter how smart you are or what great results you have or great ideas. If you can't communicate them, then you know you're working in a vacuum. And so whether from, you know, both in terms of as students, you do need to write a thesis. Often you want to get papers out. Once you leave U of T, either to go into professional practice or on to, you know, academia or whatever, you will be involved in report writing, paper generation, and proposal writing perhaps. So writing as a skill is absolutely essential. So this is a bit of a unusual format. I have this document, everything you want to know about report writing. I'll post a link to it later today, so if anybody wants to download, you're welcome to it. And what I'm going to do is just go through this document and talk about various things. And I think part of the purpose of this is this document itself, I think, is designed to demonstrate the hints and ideas and the guidelines and so forth that I'm suggesting. So the report itself is, this document is laid out in the way I would write a technical report, for example. So for example, we have a title page, a cover page. We have an executive summary that summarizes things. We have a table of contents, and this is what I'm going to go through in various levels of detail. So I do want to talk about report organization. I want to say some comments about style. I'm going to spend a fair bit of time actually on nitty-gritties of grammar and syntax, because I think at the end of the day, this is where, I don't know, 80% of challenges for most students lie is just in the nitty-gritties of how you write a sentence properly. And then more briefly talking about you know, how we use tables and figures, a word about spelling and referencing and so forth. This is certainly not a comprehensive or exhaustive discussion of the topic. I'm just picking on a few key things are things that I think are important. It's certainly not a replacement, for example, for taking a writing course. And you know, the faculty runs a number of excellent courses for to help you develop your skills in technical report writing. If you haven't taken one of these courses, I would strongly recommend you do so, particularly if English is your second or third or fourth language. But even for native speakers, it can often very much help. So again, this is just a bit of a cook's tour through a number of items I'd like to, you know, bring to your attention. And so to begin with, how you organize a report obviously is extremely important. You're telling a story, whether it's a technical report. I mean, we don't usually think about it as a story, but a technical report, a paper, a thesis, it's a story that you're telling, and it has to make sense to people. People have to be able to understand what you're saying, and they have to particularly see a logical flow through the document. And so if they don't understand why they're reading this or what what you're trying to say to them, and at the end of the day, if they don't understand what they've been told, then you haven't succeeded. So, a report, a technical report, paper, whatever, has to be logically organized. It has to have a flow that makes sense to people, so people can understand why one thing's leading to another, and why we're talking about this at this point in time, and how the pieces fit together. So there's an old adage that says that in any sort of document like this, you have to do three things. You tell the reader what you're going to tell them. In other words, there's an introduction, a motivation, some context setting. You tell them, you talk about your methods and your literature review and your results, and then you tell them that they've been told. What was this document about? The summaries, conclusions. Here's a reprise on what the key points are. So people have to understand. Oh, this is what we're going to talk about. Oh, isn't this interesting? Here's all the things that we're learning, and then at the end, well, what have I learned? What's the takeaway in this story? And so from there, we could expand that to and to think about how we do organize a report, and this will vary depending on whether we're talking about a paper, a thesis, a technical report, somewhat. It also varies depending on is this a 2-page just little memo, or is it a 200-page PhD thesis? Obviously, the bigger the report, the more important this organization is, and a very logical, structured flow is. But I think it's important in all cases. And so as this document is illustrating, a classic technical report of some substance, we'll have a title page, we'll have an executive summary or abstract up front that very concisely, in just a couple of paragraphs or so, really provides a highlight for people, and then we take people in a very structured way through. The table of contents is very important, so people can see at the outset the structure, and so organizing this way makes it easy for the reader to understand what you're saying and how things connect. And again, I think that's a very important thought to always have in mind when you're writing anything. You're writing this for a reader, and so first question there, well, who is my audience? Is it a very technical, skilled group of professionals? Is it just the general public? Is it something in between? So knowing who your audience is very important, and you should write to that audience in a way that they will understand things. But you also have to always be thinking that you're writing this for somebody to read and understand. And so an executive summary or an abstract is very important, in that so that people read that to decide whether they even want to read the rest of the report of the paper. I think you've probably experienced this with your own literature reviews. You read an abstract and you say, yeah, you know what, I don't need to read the rest of this paper, or oh, that sounds interesting, maybe I should. If you're out working or you're submitting a professional report, very often very busy decision makers, whether that's your manager or the mayor, or whoever is you're reporting to, maybe the executive summary is the only thing they're going to read. So you have to make sure that carries a punch and really carries some key ideas. So how one organizes a report, so I have an outline here of a typical organization, but things can vary. For example, we tend to deal with very technical things, so we usually have to discuss the methods that we're using and describe them. We have to discuss, we're very usually working with empirical data, so we have to talk about the data, and then we have to talk about the results. In different applications, different combinations may be, ordering of this and how we organize it may make more sense. Maybe you discuss the data first, because the data really shapes what methods you can use. Or vice versa. We have a method, a methodology, and I'll talk about those words later, and that really drives what our data needs are. We almost always need some literature review, where almost everything we're doing sits on top of existing knowledge. We have to position what we're doing relative to what is already known. It's always important to motivate what we're doing, why we're doing it. Again, if this is a very small paper or a small study, maybe motivation just becomes part of the introduction. But if motivation, or maybe we have a very initial motivation, just a sentence or two in the introduction, and then we expand on that in a discussion. Literature review often does stand alone as a section, but sometimes, again, particularly if one has, this is a complicated, big project, a PhD thesis would be a very good example of this. It may sometimes make sense to break up the literature review by section. So maybe, because maybe, let's say in your thesis, you're doing 2 or 3 or 4 different things, each one of which has its own literature, combining it all at the beginning into one huge chapter may not be the most efficient thing, because then in the subsequent chapters, when you're discussing, well, I did this and I did this and I did this, you have to keep referencing back to that literature review or reciting the literature. So it may be more efficient to take chunks of literature and put it where it most belongs. And I think that in these comments, this illustrates, I think, also a general principle that the organization and flow of almost anything you write ideally sort of emerges naturally out of your writing. What makes sense in this case? Again, what tells the best story in the most efficient, effective way, and organize it that way. So very often I find, I may start out with kind of one organization of a paper, and then or report, and maybe it changes a little bit as I'm writing it, because I realize, oh, here's a better way to organize things. Here's a better way to tell the story. The connections become smoother. The logic of each step becomes more apparent. So as with everything, I think there's no one size fits all, but one way or the other, you do have to have a plan, and you do have to have a well-organized presentation at the end of the day. Similarly, results and discussion of results again will vary. I mean, in some, I think a good example of one approach is if you are an experimentalist, and that's not a laboratory experimentalist, you're mixing chemicals and getting reactions and whatever, which is not the sort of thing we tend to do here. But there are situations in which maybe you are running an experiment, or maybe a survey would fall into this category, where the common practice is you would have a section that literally presents results. Here's the data, here's the tables, here's the graphs, and then you have a discussion section that comes later to discuss those results and what the implications of the findings are. I certainly personally find, and I think in transportation, it generally makes more sense to combine the presentation of the results and the discussion of the results in one section, because again, it becomes very artificial. You present a table and results, and then 4 pages later, you start discussing that table and its implications. And again, that's not a very efficient way of doing things. And I think it's confusing for the reader, because you've got to be flipping back and forth and so forth. So I think in general, that results section, it may have results and discussion of results or presentation of results, usually goes in one section. Again, in a larger piece of work, maybe there is still a subsequent discussion section that pulls various pieces together to provide some overview discussion. That may make some sense. And again, finally, at the end of the paper, the thesis, there should be a summary section that really does remind people what the study purpose was, the key things that were done, and the key findings. And it should be pulling together these conclusions, recommendations, and again, in a very, very clear way, particularly if there are recommendations. So let's say you are doing a technical report, you're a consultant to the city or the MTO, again, many of the decision makers may read the executive summary, and the next thing they read will be your recommendations or conclusions at the end. Okay, so we'll trust you that you did whatever you're supposed to do well. What are you recommending? And those clear recommendations will be very important. And also in this summary or concluding section, there really shouldn't be new material, new discussion. You are reiterating, you're reinforcing what's been done. So if all of a sudden in this conclusion you're introducing new ideas and new references, you know, and new numbers, I mean that's very poor organization. The conclusion should be summarizing what you've already said. So if there are new ideas, you should be putting them back up in the paper or the report somewhere where they belong. And finally, another technical aspect of of structuring your report is, I think the report needs to have a very clear hierarchical structure in terms of how it's how it's divided up into sections. Again, if this is a 1-page or 2-page little thing, you maybe don't need headings and subsections and so forth, but anything of any complexity beyond that, again, to help the reader keep track of where you are, to separate out the introduction from the literature review and so forth, you're going to need sections, you're going to need subsections. There's lots of different ways of representing that. You can use different fonts, different colors, different sizes, and so forth. I'm a very, very, very strong proponent of using a numbering scheme, a hierarchical number scheme. This is illustrating one way of doing this, combined with some judicious use of different fonts, italics, bold, etc., to further help. I mean, there are some journals and there's some some other styles where you just are using some combination of color and bold, italic, font size, etc., to differentiate these things. That can work, but I find when I'm deep, when I'm in, I mean, if I'm on page 57 of a 200-page report and I see a heading that's light blue, italics, font size 9, I don't really remember, is that the second level, is that the third level, is it the fourth level? So I think numbering helps very much. Having said that, I don't think you want to go typically beyond about 3 levels, as showing here, because if you start to have subsection 2.2.2.1, 0.5, again, that's starting to become more complicated. I think thinking in terms of at most about 3 levels in your hierarchy, then maybe you're doing something else if you really have to divide things up more. So this is just one style, and through all of this, I'm going to be showing. Well, let's move on and talk about style, because as I say, there's many different approaches to doing this, and I think style is very important. But this is where legitimate differences can certainly exist. Different people, different organizations, different papers will have different style settings or stylistic preferences. I think throughout all of this, I think the key thing, and something I will beat on, I'm sure, throughout my talk, is consistency. Whatever stylistic choices you make, stick with it. Be consistent. My own students will tell you, this is something I harp on, that if you're using one kind of spelling, I'll talk about American versus British or Canadian spelling. If you're using American spelling, stick with it. Don't bounce back and forth. If you're using one way of referencing figures, stick with it. Don't bounce back and forth. Particularly if you're writing a big document like a thesis, it's very easy to sort of drift and use something one place, something the other. But this gets in the way of the reader. The reader's going to notice it. Reviewers are going to notice this. So whatever style you choose, for whatever reason, stick with it. Again, I'm not going to try to tell you everything there is to know about this. An excellent reference on how to write technical reports and style and so forth is Strunk and White. It's a classic. I mean, I'm referencing a very old version here, but it's very important to I think to establish your style and stick with it. So and I think some key points is particularly for technical report writing, the writing should be concise. You say what you need to say, but no more. You should avoid long sentences and long paragraphs. Keep points sharp and clear. I must confess this is something that kind of comes under the category of do what I say, not what I do, because I must confess I'm guilty sometimes of overly long, flowery sentences and long paragraphs. I'm a frustrated closet. In another life I would have written novels instead of technical reports, I think. But the advice very much is to try to keep sentences short, to the point, punchy, so they're very clear. They're easy for the reader to understand what you're saying. As I'll talk about, short sentences also help you avoid making various errors in English usage as well. You should always be calm and measured, not rhetorical or polemic, not argumentative. We should write in a very objective, measured way. Something that I think is very good practice, but different people will have different views on this, is I think reports and papers should be written in the present tense wherever possible, except when you're clearly describing past actions. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. And my personal opinion is that we should write in the third person, as opposed, so that the results show, or the conclusion one can draw from this is this, not that I think this or we did that. Now, usage of the first person, either singular or plural, is becoming much more common in technical report writing, and there are occasions where you really are expressing your own personal opinions. And it may just become, very contrived to say, well, one might think this, so there is some flexibility there. But I think by and large, the third person is appropriate for technical reports. Further, certainly if you are submitting papers to journals or even your thesis to School of Graduate Studies, there are style guides. There are very much, this is the way we want it. This is the formatting. We want double spaced. We want margins this size. We want this typeface. We want American or English spelling, British spelling. In all those sorts of cases, pay attention. Submit the paper that corresponds to the style guide. Nothing will lead to a quicker rejection, or at least severe aggravation on the part of reviewers if you don't submit. You don't write in according to the style guide. So follow it. In the absence of such guidelines, I think you are free to choose the style, typographic style. I think it should be clean, professional looking. I personally believe that for most purposes, 12-point font is minimum size, but probably not much larger. Choose a font that you like. Obviously, this document's in Times New Roman. It's what I'm used to. It's what I like. Some people find it prefer something a little crisper and cleaner even than this. But again, stick with it. Decide what you want and why you like it. Paragraph spacing. Two perfectly appropriate styles. One, do not indent the first line of a paragraph, but have a blank line of some size between paragraphs, or you don't necessarily need a line between paragraphs if you indent. Sometimes people do both. What's unacceptable, in my view, is to not indent and not have a line space between paragraphs, because then it's very hard for the reader often to tell where one paragraph ends. I think 1-inch margins all around is the default. There has to be good reasons. I would say usually because you're being told to use margins of some other magnitude. Please number all pages. As a marker of graduate course term papers, Nothing drives me more crazy than to receive a 15-page paper that has no numbers attached to the pages. So if I want to make a comment on page 3, you did this, I have to number them themselves. I mean, I think, so number your pages. You'd be surprised how often this is not done, even in, journal paper submissions sometimes. Justification, again, is a style thing. I tend to like to left justify only. I mean, there was a time where everybody was using full justification. I think that actually leads to a clunkier looking report usually, but again, this is a style thing. Bold, italics, underlining can be used for emphasis and differentiating things, for maybe defining things. Whatever you're using, be consistent in usage, and generally try not to be overdo the usage of them. If every fourth word is in bold, well, then it loses its effect. And finally, when you are referencing figures, tables, and so on, again, there's no standard style. Maybe the paper, the journal you're submitting to has a style. So do you capitalize figure, table? Do you write out figure, or just fig dot? Fig dot or whatever, up to a point. Unless you're instructed, you can choose, but be consistent, please. So as I say, I mean, we could talk all day about any of these topics and about style and so forth, but those are a few issues. Grammar and syntax. So this is, as I say, this is something that I think these are really nitty-gritties. Many. I mean, well, there's some big issues about grammar. I'm assuming people kind of understand how to construct an English sentence. You know what a noun is, what a verb is. You know about phrases and clauses and so forth. Again, not that that's trivial, but I think it's the little things that I think in my experience, trip up students by far the most. Your report's well organized, your ideas are there, in general, your sentence constructions and paragraphs, spacing and so on, all kind of makes sense. And then it's these nitty-gritty things that just get in the way for the reader to understand what you're doing. And it sounds so simple, and it really, but the choosing between singular and plural words and usage, articles, and just the tense in which you're working. I think these are it sounds picky, but you're trying to read somebody's thesis, and on every page there's multiple errors with respect to mixing singular and plural, using the wrong article, mixing your tenses, and it really just gets in the way of understanding what you're presenting. And at some point, it interferes with the reader appreciating what you're having to say. If they're having to wade through a sentence that doesn't quite make sense because of these little things, eventually, they're going to start to wonder about, what are you trying to say? Do you really know what you're trying to say? And so on. So I think it is worth harping on these things, and I think you will find that often these are the things that will trip you up the most, and your supervisor or whoever, you'll spend more time editing this stuff than anything else. And I also think that these tend to be things that people, particularly people coming to English as their second or third language, even sometimes if you've been trained in school in English, people struggle with, because these are things that I think I'm not a linguist, but I think the concept of singular, plural, articles, and so forth vary very much between languages. Obviously, languages vary in huge ways, but I think it is become kind of wired to think in a certain way, and even when we're speaking English, we can get away with all these things. The sorts of things I'm talking about here, when we're having a conversation, verbal conversation, it doesn't really matter. We clearly understand what you're saying, and it doesn't get in the way. But once it's on the written page, it does become a barrier, I think, or more of a problem. So the first issue is singular versus plural, and and there's two aspects of this. And the most important one, I think, is every sentence has a noun and a verb. Or has a subject. Well, they have several nouns, but in particular, there's a subject noun and there's a verb. Something does something. That's the basic construct of a sentence, and that noun, that subject noun, he, she, I, the stick, Bob, the organization, whatever, does something. So that noun is always is either a singular or a plural, and whatever it is, the verb will also have a singular or a plural form, and it has to be consistent. Otherwise, the sentence just doesn't scan properly. So if the noun is singular, the verb must be singular, and vice versa. And so when I talked about short sentences, one way to try to ensure that happens, or that you can see that there's this consistency, is keep sentences short and try to keep the noun and verb close to one another. And so that helps alert you when you're just reading the sentence, I've mixed and matched here. So the bigger, the more convoluted the sentence is, sometimes it's just more difficult to see that. This is one area where I think the editing features in Microsoft Word or whatever word processor you're using really helps you. Word is pretty smart these days. It will often pick up this inconsistency. It won't do it all the time. So I guess just general advice is certainly have your grammar and spelling check on all the time when you're editing. I'm surprised not everybody seems to do that. And certainly anything it picks up, take advantage of that, but don't trust it. There are cases where it won't. It may even be wrong. It may get confused by what you're doing, but it may not also catch everything. And so don't use it, but don't you still are responsible for copy editing on words. But I also, I don't know whether this is helpful or not, but just to illustrate the sorts of issues here, and maybe to help yourself sort this out, because this is not necessarily intuitive to everybody. Just a couple examples of think of some very simple sentence where the singular plural mix is very clear. So think of just a very stupid sentence. The stick are light. The verb should be is. Stick is singular. Are is a plural verb. Is the singular. So the correct version of that sentence probably is the stick is light. And as I say, something like this, hopefully when you read that sentence as it's written, you say, no, that's wrong. Similarly, vice versa, the sticks is in the box. Well, sticks is plural. The word sticks is plural. And so it should be the sticks are in the box. And so, this would be very tedious, but, if you're writing something and you look at a sentence and you're a little confused, maybe thinking about these very simple templates, examples, might actually help you sort it out. And eventually, maybe this becomes intuitive and it becomes much easier. The second one is, should we be, for the noun, for the subject, is it singular or is it plural? Which do we mean? Which is appropriate? In many cases, we can actually choose which way we want to write the sentence. So maybe in my first sentence there, it's actually a typo. What the author really meant to say was the sticks are light. It actually meant to talk about multiple sticks, and either there's a confusion about the singular or plural of the word stick, or it's just a typo. So that may be a possibility. So defense against typos, there's really not much except to proofread very carefully and make sure you're saying what you're saying. And so that's again, singular versus plural. This is something that trips people up a lot. The second one is articles, and I think probably this, in my experience, this is the single biggest problem many students have. We're talking about two simple little words, a or a, and the, and then and as as an extension of a. how difficult can it be to use these two words properly? But it's amazingly difficult for many students. So I think this is it's a real challenge with English. I mean, again, I'm not a linguist. I unfortunately really don't speak any other language, so I can't really speak for it. But I think a characteristic of English is its looseness when it comes to rules and what's correct and what's not. I think that's one of English's great strengths is its flexibility. You can do all sorts of things with it, but it also makes it very difficult for people coming to the language to learn the rules or to understand the unwritten rules, to understand what sounds right versus what doesn't. And I think there's no way around it except just like everything else by practice. The more you write, the more you speak, the more you read, I would say, the easier that sort of flow and just being able to cast a sentence in a way that works. And articles are a big part of it. But having said that, there are rules that I think you can keep in mind that will take you a long way. They get broken once in a while, but there are, I think, fairly clear rules in the use of articles. So first of all, except when they're not applied, which is the problem with English. So first of all is singular nouns generally have an article. A or and, if we have a vowel next to it, and the are both singular articles. So if we're basically any noun that is singular should have an article attached to it, except I'll talk about when not. So a is used when the noun is referring to a general or non-specific example of the object, and the is used when referring to a particular specific example. So a stick is a piece of wood. That could be any stick, it could be any piece of wood. The stick he carved from the leftover wood is missing. So we're referencing a specific stick, not just any stick, the stick he carved, and it was carved from not any old wood, it was the leftover wood. So the refers to something specific, a refers to a generic. And I think in my footnote I say, if anybody's into object orientation, maybe I mentioned this later, a refers to a class, like whereas the refers to an instance of the class, if you will, so if the correct pronoun, the correct article depends on is it general or is it specific? Sometimes that's less clear. Sometimes you could go either way, but hopefully within the context it makes sense. Now, a singular noun can stand alone without an article. If typically when it's in two cases, one, it's being modified by another word. So in my sentence here, one example of this is demonstrated by this sentence. Example is singular, sentence is singular, but I don't have to put an article on it because one is serving the same purpose as the article. I mean, I could have written an example of this is demonstrated by it has to be still this sentence. So this is replacing the, one is replacing and. So often if we have a modifier like this that is indicating whether it's general or specific, we don't need the article. And indeed, again, trying to sort out, do I need an a or a the here? Try substituting in something like one or this or that or any. So if it's one or any fits there as a descriptor, then you should be using a. If this or that would fit the sentence, this is this sentence, that sentence, then the would be the article you use if you want to use it. The other time that we don't need an article for a singular noun is when there is only one example of it. So, an example here is English is the language this document is written in. We don't say the English because there is only one English language. And so no article is needed to modify it. Similarly, religion is the opiate of the masses, Mark's famous comment. So this is a little different, a little more complicated. There are many religions, but he's referring to, if you will, the abstract class of religion as a single universal concept. And again, maybe a little more complicated or obscure, a stick is a piece of wood. Again, referring to, in a sense, the general class or concept of wood. So it's neither specific or, and you say, well, why wouldn't we say a wood? Well, we don't have to, again, because it's a totally general, abstract kind of concept. It just doesn't need an article. On the plural side, the is the only plural article. A is never used to modify plural nouns. So we again use the to modify specific instances. So the shows up both as a singular article and a plural article. In both cases, however, it's being used to modify or indicate the specific instance of something, whether it's singular or plural. Again, if there's if in the general case, which we might have used a for in the singular case, the general plural case we don't modify. So sticks in general, we don't have to say a stick or the stick, right? But we could say, maybe if we are referring to a specific bundle of sticks, the sticks shorter than two, maybe. So again, depending on what you actually mean in the sentence, you might or might not use an article. I'm sure that's clear as mud. But again, practice makes perfect. And again, I will not name the student, but I did have a student once upon a time who confessed that he gave up on trying to figure this out, and he just literally randomly assigned does to various nouns on each page and hoped that some of them were correct. I hope you all find better ways of dealing with it than he did. And he has turned into a much better writer than he was at that time. As author of books and other things. Tense, finally, and I know I'm running long here as usual. I would argue in a technical report, the present tense is the one to use because what you've written is forever. Once it's on a paper, once it's published, it is there. And even though you wrote it in the past and somebody's going to read it in the future, it exists in the present forever. I would also argue that for the same reason, it's very tempting, in the introduction to say, chapter 2 will look at this. Well, chapter 2 looks at this. Again, chapter 2 exists in the present. Whether we will ever read it, whether we get to it eventually, it still is. So I would only use the past tense when referring to specific actions we did in the past, like, we conducted this survey in the following way. So that's a specific act that existed in the past that we're now describing. And similarly, I would reserve the future tense for, literally actions that may occur in the future, but referencing things that in the document itself, generally try to use the present tense. So I know I'm running long. I always run long. Tables, figures, and exhibits, please be consistent. I think figures and tables should be located in text as close to where the first reference. All figures and tables included in a document must be explicitly referenced. Never have a free-floating diagram or table that's just floating there that you don't discuss or draw attention to. Appendices can be very useful for storing large amounts of information or things that are too bulky to include in. Again, they should be referenced explicitly. Never have an appendix that's just sitting at the back of the report and you don't reference it anywhere. Spelling and word usage, we have American, British, and Canadian English. There's also, I think other Englishes out there. The key difference between American and British is in the the use of OUR versus OR in words like neighbor and behavior and color, and also the double L versus the single L. I mean, and then a much more minor one is, do you use S or Z in words like maximize? Canadian English is a mixture of the two. We generally follow British English in terms of the OURs and double Ls. Where we get completely confused is the S versus the Z. Both are acceptable. Again, and so it's really up to you to choose, but again, be consistent. And certainly, most journals either correspond to American or British English, so be sure what you're doing. Obviously, like TRB and American journals, we use American spelling. Most international journals use British spelling, but not necessarily all. Check to see what it is and submit to that. Canadian English should be used for theses. I personally think it's absolutely unacceptable to have a master's or PhD thesis at the University of Toronto that use single L's instead of double L's for modeling, or OR instead of OUR for neighbor or behavior. And those are words we use a lot. And so, you know, choose Canadian English as your spell check. It seems to me US English tends to be the default, and that leads to people, you know, using American spelling when you really don't. And finally, you know, I mean, it's Z, not Z. I have a story about that, but I'm running late. When I was a TA at MIT, I learned my lesson not to say Z when I'm in the US, but we'll leave that for another day. Don't use contractions. Do not use actions when you're writing, and so on. So I think, you know, there's a number of things we could continue to talk about. Words. My students know I have my pet peeves. I've completely given up on data. Data. The word data is plural. The singular is datum, but we've just completely lost it. Data is, people, you know, say all the time instead of data are, which is correct. I've even given up on that. But whatever you do, be consistent with it. Something that I'm still fighting the fight on, but I think losing badly, is the word methodology versus method. Methodology means the study of methods. It's not a method, but we always say my methodology is. So my argument is that a logit model is a method, random utility theory is a methodology, or whatever. So, but you know, but the one word semantics that I would be absolutely insistent on is the word parameter. Because a parameter is a coefficient or a weight in an equation. Variables are the y's and the x's, but even technical people often mix and match these things, and I think that's absolutely wrong and just leads to confusion. So, and we are by and large modelers in this group. We should know the difference between a parameter and a variable. That's something I think we should be very, very rigorous about, so that we don't confuse ourselves a little about anyone else. Referencing footnotes, lots of guidance about that. Again, that's really do the style that you're required for your thesis, for your paper, follow it. You know, make sure your references are complete. I mean, term papers and even in drafts of journal papers and so on, references are often incomplete. You're going to have to complete them, so do it from the start. Okay, so I'm close to the hour. I always say wind me up and I'll talk forever, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments or that people may want to raise. I'm happy to stay a bit past the hour. And as I say, I will post this document for people to download if it's some help. So thank you very much for asking me here. And as I say, happy to take a few questions.
Thank you so much, Professor. So if any of the audience wants to ask a question, they can use the chat box, or they can raise their hand and we'll give them the permission to turn on their audio. So I have a question actually. So
Sure.
For the limitations of our methodologies, when we're writing a technical report, when should we like include the limitations? Should we include it in the summary, or I'm a little bit confused about the position of this section.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Probably, in some cases, maybe both. I think when you're introducing your method, I think you have to justify it at that point. So presumably there's some strengths of the method that, you say we're choosing to use a mixed logit model to model this for the following reasons. I think it's also appropriate if there is some, some limitations of that, whatever the method is, it's worth raising that. But so you're presenting a balanced argument. You're saying, okay, I'm choosing this method for the following reasons. I recognize that there are these possible weaknesses, and then maybe you say, well, why it doesn't matter in this case, or how you're mitigating it. Because I think it's very appropriate to discuss the limitations as you're introducing the method, because certainly either your thesis committee or the paper reviewer is going to say, yeah, but why in the world did you choose that? Don't you realize, So I think it's always good to anticipate the criticism and meet it as best as possible. At a minimum, acknowledging, yeah, you know what, it's not perfect, but maybe it's the best I have in this case, or maybe because of data I can't do, so discuss it. So try to address that criticism when it would arise, which is when you're introducing it. In the summary and the conclusions, it might not be so much rehashing the limitations of the method, but the conversation may come up under future work. I mean, maybe there is maybe a big refresher, limitations and future work. So we did the mixed logit, but but we recognize this limitation. In future work, we will look at another method, or we know we had some limitations in our data, and future work will go out and collect better data. So I think you can discuss it in both places, but with a slightly different objective. One is to sort of address the criticism is coming. The other was talking about, well, okay, how can we do better in the future and future work? And almost everything always has future work, because we can always do better somehow, or we have the next step in the process.
Thank you so much. So I guess we don't have any other questions, so this will be the end of the session. Thank you, Professor, for your interesting and useful presentation. And the recording will be available on the ITE website, so after a couple of days, everyone can have access to that. And again, thank you, Professor, for joining us today.
Okay, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Hope it was of some use.